They shoved me through the corridor with my hands locked behind my back and a pulse rifle pressed between my shoulder blades. The restraints were Vathari military grade, two interlocking bands of living metal that tightened every time I flexed. I had stopped flexing about 3 minutes after they clamped them on. My wrists were already bruised, and the metal was still warm from the charge it used to keep itself sealed. I did not know where my crew was. I did not know why we had been pulled from our shuttle in neutral space, and I did not know why every Vathari soldier in this corridor was staring at me like I was something that had crawled out of a laboratory jar.
My name is Ethan Voss, Commander, United Earth Diplomatic Corps, 4th Rotation. I had been on my way to a routine consular meeting at Teleran Outpost when a Vathari dreadnought dropped out of fold space directly in front of our shuttle, close enough that the proximity alarm blew out the port speaker.
My pilot, Danny Marsh, had barely gotten out the first syllable of a distress call before their boarding clamps locked onto our hull and ripped the airlock open like a tin can. They separated me from Danny and our comms officer, Lena Price, within 30 seconds. No explanation, no charges read, nothing. Just 6 armored Vathari grabbing me by both arms and dragging me down a corridor that smelled like hot copper and ozone. The dreadnought was massive. I had seen Vathari warships in briefings and surveillance imagery, but nothing prepared me for the scale of it from the inside. The ceilings were 40 feet high, ribbed with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in slow rhythmic waves like the walls themselves were breathing. The floor was polished obsidian, reflective enough that I could see my own face looking back at me, pale and tight-jawed, and trying very hard not to look terrified. Each step echoed in triplicate, my boots on stone, and then the stone throwing the sound back twice from the curved walls, so that every footfall came with its own ghost. We passed through a security gate where a Vathari officer scanned my biosignature with a device that hummed against my chest and beeped once, sharply. The officer said something in Vathari that made the guards tighten their grip on my arms. We kept moving, faster now. The corridor widened, and the bioluminescent veins in the walls shifted color from pale amber to deep violet, and the air grew thicker, denser, charged with something that made the hair on my arms stand up. We turned a final corner, and the corridor opened into something else entirely. It was a throne chamber. That was the only word for it. The room was cathedral vast, with tiered balconies rising on both sides, packed with Vathari courtiers in ceremonial carapace armor that gleamed under the bioluminescent light. There were hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. Every single one of them was looking at me. The silence was so complete that I could hear the magnetic hum of my own restraints. The Vathari are not a species you forget once you have seen them. They stand 7 feet tall on average, with exoskeletal frames that look like someone fused insect chitin with reptilian scale. Their faces are angular, almost geometric, with compound eyes that fracture light into dozens of tiny reflections. They move with a precision that makes human athletes look clumsy, and they are, by every diplomatic metric that exists, the single most dangerous civilization humanity has ever encountered. "11 years of Cold War tension. 11 years of border skirmishes, trade embargoes, and back-channel threats that never quite became open warfare. No human had ever stood where I was standing. No human had ever been brought before the Vathari Imperial Court. I was either about to make history or become a footnote in an incident report. A sound rolled through the chamber. It was not a voice. It was a vibration, a deep harmonic pulse that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. The courtiers on the balconies shifted, turning their heads upward in unison. I followed their gaze. She descended from the upper tier on a platform of dark crystal, and I understood immediately why every eye in the room had moved. The queen was different from every Vathari I had ever seen. She was taller, 8 feet at least, and her carapace was not the dull gunmetal of her soldiers, or the polished bronze of her courtiers. It was black, deep lustrous black, threaded with veins of gold bioluminescence that pulsed with each step she took. Her compound eyes were larger, more luminous, fractured into amber and violet facets that caught the light and threw it back in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like language. A headdress of dark metal and crystal framed her skull, and when she moved, the light followed her, as if the room itself was bending toward her presence. She stepped off the platform and walked toward me. The courtiers did not move. I do not think they breathed. The chamber was so quiet that I could hear the click of her clawed feet on the obsidian floor. Each step precise, each step deliberate, each step bringing her closer. She passed through a shaft of light from the bioluminescent ceiling, and the gold threads in her carapace blazed, and for a moment, she looked less like a living being and more like something carved from the heart of a dying star. She stopped 3 feet from me and tilted her head. Up close, the compound eyes were extraordinary. Each facet was a different shade, amber bleeding into violet, bleeding into something that had no name in any human color spectrum. And they moved independently, dozens of tiny lenses adjusting and refocusing, reading me from every angle simultaneously. Then she spoke. Not in Vathari. In English. Perfect, unaccented, flawless English, as if she had been born speaking it. Human, she said. Remember me? I stared at her. I searched every angle of that alien face, every facet of those compound eyes, every ridge and plate and luminous thread of her carapace. Nothing. I had served in Vathari-adjacent postings for 6 years. I had attended diplomatic functions, reviewed intelligence briefings, studied cultural profiles. I had never seen this individual before in my life. I was certain of it. No, I said. I don't. The court gasped. It was not a human gasp. It was a sharp, chittering intake of air through mandibles that rippled through the chamber like a wave. Several courtiers stepped back from the railing. I saw 2 soldiers near the door adjust their grip on their weapons. The sound echoed off the domed ceiling and came back down distorted. 1,000 alien voices compressed into a single note of collective shock. The queen did not gasp. She did not step back. She stood perfectly still, and her compound eyes shifted, the amber facets dimming, the violet ones brightening, and something moved across her expression that I had never seen on a Vathari face before. It took me a moment to place it, because I was not expecting it. I was expecting anger, or contempt, or the cold imperial dismissal of a species beneath notice. What I saw instead was none of those things. It was pain. Raw, unguarded, unmistakable pain. The kind that does not perform itself for an audience. The kind that leaks through, even when every barrier is up. She raised one clawed hand and made a single sharp gesture. The courtiers moved immediately, filing out through side exits with a speed and discipline that spoke of long practice. Within 60 seconds, the chamber was empty. Every door sealed, every balcony cleared. It was just the 2 of us, standing in a room built for 1,000, with nothing between us but 3 feet of air and a silence that felt heavier than gravity. Then I will remind you, she said. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the ceremonial resonance, reduced to something that was almost conversational, almost intimate. Kytheris Station, 14 years ago. The name hit me like a fist to the sternum. Kytheris Station. I had not heard those words spoken aloud in over a decade, and I had spent considerable effort making sure of that. Kytheris Station was a joint species relief hub in the Tessaran corridor, a place where humans and Vathari and half a dozen other species had maintained an uneasy cooperation during the border disputes. I had been 23 years old, a junior rescue medic on a 6-month rotation, young enough to believe that saving lives was a simple thing, and that the universe rewarded good intentions. Then the reactor failed. Not a malfunction, a catastrophic cascade failure that turned the lower decks into an inferno within 4 minutes. Evacuation sirens, screaming in 6 languages, bulkheads melting, emergency lighting cutting out and coming back in strobes that turned every corridor into a nightmare of shadow and flame. I remembered the heat. I remembered the way the air itself seemed to burn when you breathed it in, searing the lining of your throat and your lungs until every breath was a decision to endure pain. I remembered Kytheris Station. I remembered it in my bones, in the scar tissue on my back, in the dreams that had taken 3 years of therapy to push below the surface. I see you remember the station, the Queen said. She was watching my face with those compound eyes, reading every micro-expression, every flicker of recognition that I could not suppress. Now remember what you did there. Sector 9, Sublevel 4. The fire had reached the ventilation system. The temperature was above what your species should survive. You were moving toward the evacuation corridor when you heard something. I was breathing harder now. I could feel it. My heart rate was climbing, and my hands were shaking inside the restraints. And I was back there. I was back in that corridor, with the ceiling dripping molten polymer, and the smoke so thick I was navigating by touch against the wall. The alarm had stopped working in that sector. The sprinkler system had burned through 20 minutes earlier. I was alone, or I thought I was alone, until I heard it. A sound, small, thin, almost lost beneath the roar of the fire. A high-pitched clicking that cut through the chaos like a needle through cloth. Rhythmic, desperate, the sound of something alive and terrified, and running out of time. "A child," I said. My voice came out rough, scraped raw by memory. "A Vathari child." "Yes," the Queen said, pinned under a collapsed support beam. Carapace cracked along the dorsal ridge, leaking fluid. Alone. Every Vathari rescue team had pulled back from that sector, because the thermal readings exceeded survivable parameters for our species. And for yours. But you did not pull back. I closed my eyes. I could see her. Small. So much smaller than any Vathari I had encountered before. Barely 4 feet tall. Her carapace, the pale translucent green of a juvenile, cracked down the center of her back with iridescent fluid leaking through the fissure. She was clicking, over and over, the same high, frantic pattern, and her compound eyes were wide and fracturing light in all directions. And she was so terrified that her small clawed hands were leaving scratches in the metal floor as she tried to pull herself free from beneath the beam that was crushing her lower thorax. "I carried her," I said. 2 kilometers. Through the fire. "You shielded her with your body," the Queen said. "You put your back between her and the flames. You wrapped your arms around her, and you bent over her, so that every spark, every ember, every gust of superheated air hit you instead. The burn scars. You still carry them." I did. Across my shoulders and down my spine. 3rd degree. Deep tissue. The kind that synthetic skin grafts could smooth over cosmetically, but never fully erase. I could still feel the tightness when I stretched too far. The pull of scar tissue that had fused itself to the muscle beneath. A permanent reminder written into my body of the night I ran 2 kilometers through a burning station with a dying alien child pressed against my chest. "On the evacuation shuttle," the Queen continued, and her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "The life support was calibrated for human physiology. The ambient temperature was 14 degrees below Vathari juvenile survival threshold. I was going into thermal shock. My circulatory system was slowing. My neural activity was dropping toward critical levels. There was no Vathari medical team on that shuttle. There were 43 human evacuees and 1 Vathari juvenile, and the only person who noticed that I was dying was the same person who had pulled me from the fire." I remembered. I remembered stripping off my jacket and wrapping it around her. And it was not enough. Her body temperature was dropping faster than the insulation could compensate, so I pulled her onto my lap and held her against my chest, skin to carapace. My body heat the only warmth source in the entire shuttle. 6 hours. I held her for 6 hours, while the shuttle limped toward the nearest medical station. I talked to her the entire time, not because I thought she understood, but because the sound of a continuous human voice seemed to calm the frantic clicking. I told her she was going to be fine. I told her she was brave. I told her she was going to grow up and do extraordinary things, and that she was not allowed to die because I said so, and I meant it with every cell in my body. "You said something," the Queen murmured. "At the end, when the medical team finally arrived and you handed me over. You leaned down and you whispered something. I remembered. I remembered the Vathari medical team pulling her from my arms, and the sudden cold emptiness against my chest, and the way her small clawed hand had gripped my finger and would not let go until the sedative took effect. I had leaned down and whispered into the space where I assumed her auditory receptors were, and I said the only thing that felt true in that moment. I said, "You are going to be someone important. I can tell." The Queen was silent for a long moment. The bioluminescence in her carapace dimmed and then flared, a slow pulse that looked almost like breathing. Then she reached up with one clawed hand and touched the center of her own chest, the exact place where I had held her against me 14 years ago. "My name is Sirethi Vel Karaxis," she said. I am the 42nd sovereign of the Vathari Empire, and I have spent 14 years searching for you." I could not speak. I stood there in my restraints, in the empty throne chamber of the most powerful warship in the quadrant, and I looked at her. I looked at the gold-threaded carapace, and the luminous compound eyes, and the 8 feet of imperial authority, and somewhere beneath all of it, I could still see her. The small pale green juvenile with the cracked shell, and the terrified clicking, and the desperate grip on my finger that would not let go even when the sedative was pulling her under. "I did not bring you here for sentiment," Cyrethi said, and her voice hardened, and the queen replaced the child so quickly that I almost flinched. "I brought you here because in 72 hours, the Vathari High Council will finalize a vote that has already been cast. The vote passed, Commander Voss. War against humanity. Full authorization. The invasion fleet is assembling at the Kasara threshold as we speak. 600 warships, 40 billion soldiers. Enough firepower to glass every human colony between here and your homeworld." The words landed on me like falling masonry. Each sentence was heavier than the last, and by the time she finished, I felt like I was standing under a collapsing ceiling all over again. Except this time, the ceiling was the future of my entire species. "The fleet will launch in 3 days, Cyrethi said. "And I intercepted your shuttle because you are the only human I will permit to stand before my war council and argue for your species' right to exist." I stared at her. My mouth was dry. My hands had stopped shaking and gone numb inside the restraints. "Why me?" I asked. "I am a mid-level diplomatic officer. I carry no authority to negotiate on behalf of Earth. I have no mandate, no credentials, no briefing materials. There are ambassadors and senior negotiators who have spent their entire careers preparing for exactly this kind of situation. Because you carried me through fire," she said, and the simplicity of it cut through every objection I could muster. "Because you held me for 6 hours and talked me back from death. Because the man who did that is the only human I have ever known, and if humanity is what you are, then I need my counsel to see it. And if humanity is not what you are, if you were an exception rather than a representative, then nothing can save your species, and the fleet launches regardless." She turned and walked back toward her crystal platform, and the gold veins in her carapace pulsed brighter with each step, and she did not look back. "You have tonight to prepare," she said. "I suggest you do not waste it." The doors unsealed. Guards entered. They led me away, and as I walked through the obsidian corridor with the bioluminescent walls pulsing around me, I understood 2 things with absolute clarity. The first was that the little girl I had saved was now the most powerful being in the quadrant. The second was that she had not brought me here to save me. She had brought me here to decide if my entire species deserved to live. And she was not sure of the answer. The guards took me to a chamber that was not a cell, but was certainly not a guest suite. It was a hexagonal room with a sleeping platform carved from the same dark stone as the rest of the ship, a small basin of circulating water, and a viewing port that looked out into open space. Through the port, I could see the curve of the dreadnought's hull stretching away into darkness, and beyond it, the cold permanent glitter of stars that did not care whether humanity survived the week. I sat on the edge of the platform and pressed my freed hands against my face. The restraints had been removed at the door, and my wrists were ringed with bruises that were already darkening to purple. I pressed my thumbs against my closed eyelids and watched the red-black patterns behind them, and tried to breathe evenly, and failed. Kythera Station. 14 years. The child I had carried through fire was the queen of the Vathari Empire, and she had engineered my capture because a war was coming that would end everything I had ever known. Every colony, every city, every person I had ever served with, trained with, shared a meal with. All of it balanced on a knife edge, and the only thing standing between survival and annihilation was a mid-level diplomatic officer with burn scars on his back and no idea what he was going to say. I had no briefing documents, no intelligence summaries, no communication with Earth. I did not even know if Danny and Lena were alive. I was one man in a hexagonal room on an alien warship, and in less than 12 hours, I would stand before a council of warlords and try to talk them out of the largest military operation in galactic history. I stood up. I walked to the viewing port. I pressed my forehead against the cold surface and stared out at the stars. and I began to think. Not about protocols, not about training, about Catheris Station, and a dying child, and the 6 longest hours of my life, and what it meant that she remembered every word I had said when I thought she could not understand me. I did not sleep that night. I did not even try. I stood at that viewing port, and I thought about what I was going to say to a room full of beings who had already decided to kill everyone I had ever loved, and I searched for the words that might make them stop. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, measured by my own biological clock because there was no clock on the wall and no sunrise coming, I found them. Not the perfect words. There are no perfect words for talking a civilization out of a war, but the right words, the true words, the only words I had. The morning came without sunrise. There is no morning on a warship. There is only the shift in lighting frequency that tells the crew their rest cycle has ended, a gradual brightening of the bioluminescent veins in the walls from deep violet to pale amber. The guards came for me at what I estimated was 600 hours, 2 of them, both in full ceremonial armor, their compound eyes fixed on me, with the flat, expressionless attention of professional soldiers who would rather be anywhere else but would never admit it. They walked me through corridors I had not seen before, deeper into the ship, past sealed bulkheads and security checkpoints, where additional guards scanned my biosignature, and stepped aside with the stiff efficiency of personnel under observation. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became. Not with heat, but with something else. Density, importance, history, the sense that the space around me was occupied by decisions that would reshape the map of known space, and that every decision made in these corridors had weight that would outlast the beings who made them. The War Council chamber was smaller than the throne room but far more intimidating. It was a circular room, maybe 50 feet across, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time holographic projection of the Vathari fleet. I could see them up there, hundreds of warship icons arranged in formation patterns, each one tagged with classification data in Vathari script that I could not read but did not need to read because the sheer number spoke for itself. The fleet was enormous. Even in miniature holographic form, it filled the dome like a swarm of luminous predators, waiting for a signal that would send them spiraling outward toward everything I had ever known. 7 seats were arranged in a crescent at the far end of the room, each one occupied by a Vathari warlord. They were larger than average, all of them, with carapaces scarred and decorated in patterns that spoke of campaigns and conquests I could not begin to guess at. Each wore a different configuration of ceremonial armor, and each watched me enter with the particular quality of attention that predators reserve for things they are deciding whether to eat or simply crush. There was no seat for me. I was expected to stand. Cyrethi sat on an elevated platform behind and above the crescent, separated from her warlords by both height and distance. She wore the headdress of dark metal and luminous crystal, and her compound eyes burned like twin furnaces above the council. She did not acknowledge me when I entered. She did not look at me at all. This was not the same person who had whispered to me in an empty throne room. This was the queen, and the queen was watching her warlords with the careful, calculating attention of someone who had been managing dangerous alliances since before most of her courtiers knew she existed. The warlord in the center seat spoke first. His name, I would learn later, was Kesevex. He was the largest Vathari in the room, with a carapace so heavily scarred that it looked like cracked stone, and his voice was a deep, grinding rumble that I felt in my sternum before the translation device caught up with it. "This is the creature," Kesevex said. He was speaking Vathari, but a translation device embedded somewhere in the room was converting it to English, with a half-second delay that made everything sound slightly displaced, slightly unreal. "This is what the Queen offers instead of war. One human, unarmed, unranked, no fleet behind him, no authority before him. A curiosity brought before this council, as a delay tactic while the humans scramble to prepare a defense they cannot mount." A murmur of clicking from the other warlords. I could not read Vathari body language well enough to know if it was amusement or contempt. Probably both. "I have reviewed the Queen's petition for diplomatic audience," Kesevex continued. "I find it unprecedented, irregular, and without legal foundation in the war codes. However, I have agreed to hear this human speak, if only to demonstrate to the Council the futility of negotiation, with a species that cannot even defend itself in a formal setting. He turned those scarred compound eyes on me. Up close, his face looked like a battlefield, ridged with old wounds that had healed into thick, raised lines of scar tissue that crossed his carapace, like the contour lines on a topographical map of violence. "Speak, human. Tell us why we should not burn your worlds." I had prepared for this, not with notes or talking points, but with a decision I had made at 3 in the morning while staring at stars through a viewport. Somewhere in the long, dark hours before dawn, I had realized that begging would not work. Posturing would not work. Appeals to morality or shared interest or galactic community would not work, because these were not beings who operated on those principles. These were warlords. They had climbed to power over the bodies of their rivals, and they understood exactly one language. It was not diplomacy. It was not sentiment. It was consequence. "You should not burn our worlds," I said, "because you will not survive the attempt." The clicking stopped. Every compound eye in the room locked onto me, with the simultaneous focus of 7 apex predators who had just heard something unexpected from something they considered prey. "You have 600 warships," I said, 40 billion soldiers. Enough firepower to glass every human colony in the spiral arm. I am not disputing your capability. I am not standing here to tell you that you cannot do it. You can. Probably. What I am telling you is what happens after you do it. I took a step forward, not aggressive, but deliberate. I wanted them to see that I was choosing to move toward them, not away. Earth maintains a strategic doctrine called total reciprocity. It was developed 70 years ago, during our first decade of interstellar expansion, by a committee of military strategists who understood that we would eventually encounter a civilization capable of destroying us. The doctrine has been updated and refined every year since. It means that for every action taken against us, an equal or greater response is already authorized, already programmed, and already deployed. You glass a colony, our automated defense platforms glass one of yours. You destroy a fleet, our deep space deterrent network launches a counterstrike against your nearest shipyard. You push all the way to Earth, and the Scorchline protocol activates. I let that phrase sit in the air for a moment. I had seen intelligence assessments suggesting that the Vathari had fragmentary knowledge of the Scorchline protocol, but had never been able to confirm its existence. I was about to confirm it. The Scorchline protocol is a system of distributed orbital bombardment platforms hidden across 60 star systems in both human and neutral space. They are autonomous, hardened against electronic warfare, and programmed with a single directive. If Earth falls, they activate. Every platform fires simultaneously, targeting every inhabited world and military installation within range, ours and yours. Everything burns. The protocol was not designed to win a war. It was designed to make winning impossible, to guarantee that any civilization that destroys humanity does not survive to celebrate. Kesevex leaned forward in his seat. "You describe mutual destruction. That is the argument of a species too weak to fight on equal terms." "No," I said. "It is the argument of a species that has been fighting since before we learned to write. We have been at war with ourselves for 10,000 years, Warlord. We are the only species in the galactic registry that achieved spaceflight while simultaneously maintaining the active capability to destroy our own homeworld several times over. We did not develop faster than light travel because we are brilliant. We developed it because we needed somewhere else to go in case we killed ourselves first. That is not weakness. That is the survival instinct of a species that has looked extinction in the face so many times that it has become a familiar acquaintance." I looked at each of the 7 warlords in turn, holding eye contact for a full second with each set of compound eyes before moving to the next. "You are looking at me and seeing one man. Small, soft, unarmed, no exoskeleton, no natural weapons, skin that tears if you look at it wrong, and you are making the mistake that every species makes when they first encounter humans. You are assuming that because I look fragile, my species is fragile. It is not. Humanity does not retreat from annihilation. It innovates through it. Every existential threat we have ever faced, from ice ages to asteroid impacts to diseases that killed half our population, We have responded to not with surrender, but with acceleration. You threaten us with fire, and we build better shields. You threaten us with ships, and we build better weapons. You push us to the edge, and we jump off and build wings on the way down. That is not a metaphor. That is our evolutionary history distilled into a single sentence. I paused. The silence in the chamber was so deep that I could hear the hum of the holographic projector above us, the faint click of carapace plates as one of the warlords shifted in his seat, the distant vibration of the dreadnought's engines carrying through the floor into the soles of my boots. 3 of the 7 warlords were staring at me with something that was not contempt. I would not call it fear. Vathari warlords do not fear things. But it was the closest thing to fear that their species produces. It was the recognition of a problem without a clean solution, the understanding that I had described not a battle but a trap, a war with no exit and no prize. You can win the first battle, I said. I am not denying that. You probably win the first 3 battles, maybe the first 10. But you will not win the last one, because there will always be a last one. We do not have a centralized command structure you can destroy. We do not have a single leader whose death collapses our chain of command. We are decentralized, redundant, stubborn, and genetically incapable of knowing when to quit. You will spend the next 300 years fighting a war with no victory condition, bleeding resources and soldiers into a conflict that will hollow out your empire from the inside, while we keep adapting, keep building, keep coming. And when it is over, if it is ever over, you will have won nothing, and you will have lost everything that made your civilization worth preserving. Kesavix was not one of the 3 who were shaken. He sat in his scarred carapace with his massive arms resting on the chair, and his compound eyes locked on me with something that was closer to disgust than concern. Words, he said. Threats dressed in rhetoric. You stand in our war chamber without a weapon, without a fleet, without even a functioning communicator, and you lecture us about the consequences of war, as if we have not been waging wars since your species was still throwing stones at each other in caves. He stood. He was enormous, nearly 9 feet tall, and his scarred carapace caught the light and threw jagged shadows across the floor that looked like cracks in the stone. I invoke the right of veracity, he said. The chamber reacted. The other 6 warlords turned to Kesavix, with expressions I could read even through alien features. Some of them looked almost alarmed. Cyrethi, on her elevated platform, went very still, and her claws pressed into the metal armrests of her seat, with enough force to leave visible grooves. The right of veracity, Kesavix continued, speaking to the chamber now, rather than to me, is the oldest legal instrument in Vathari law. Older than the war codes, older than the council itself. A speaker stands upon the verification floor and answers 3 questions. The bio-neural network embedded in the stone reads every physiological signal the speaker's body produces: heart rate, galvanic skin response, hormonal fluctuation, neurological micropatterns. It does not detect lies the way your species understands detection. It reads truth at a cellular level. It reaches into the nervous system and measures the gap between what a speaker says and what a speaker knows. If you speak truth, your words become legally binding testimony, admissible in all courts of the empire for all time. If you speak falsehood, the floor delivers a lethal neural discharge, instantaneous, painless, I am told, though no one has ever survived to confirm it. He looked at me. Will you submit to the right, human, or will you admit that your words are hollow? Every eye in the room was on me. I could feel the weight of it. The compound gazes from 7 different angles pressing against my skin like physical force, and above them, Cyrethi's amber-violet eyes burning down from her platform. She said nothing. Her expression gave nothing away. But I noticed the grooves her claws had left in the armrest, and I noticed that she had not blinked in over a minute. I had no idea if the bio-neural verification system could accurately read human physiology. It was designed for Vathari nervous systems, Vathari biochemistry, Vathari patterns of deception and truth. For all I knew, my baseline human heart rate and stress markers would register as deception, and the floor would kill me before I finished my first sentence. There was no way to know. There was no way to test it. There was only the choice. But the alternative was worse. If I refused, every word I had just spoken would become meaningless. The warlords would dismiss me as a coward, the vote would stand, and the fleet would launch in 3 days. I had come here to buy my species time, and time was something you purchased with risk. All currencies are denominated in what you are willing to lose. I accept, I said. 2 guards stepped forward and directed me to the center of the chamber, where a circular section of the floor was marked with concentric rings of embedded crystal that I had not noticed before. I stepped onto it. The crystal beneath my feet hummed and grew warm, and I felt a tingling sensation crawl up through my legs and into my spine, spreading outward through my nervous system like roots pushing through soil. The floor was reaching into me, finding every nerve, every synapse, every electrical impulse that made up the machinery of my thoughts. It was not painful. It was intimate in a way that made pain seem preferable. 3 questions, Kesavek said, settling back into his seat with the satisfaction of someone who had just sprung a trap. Think carefully, human. The floor does not offer second chances. The first question came from the warlord, seated farthest to the left, a lean, angular female with a carapace the color of burnished copper, and eyes that moved with quick, precise adjustments, like the autofocus mechanism of a targeting system. Do humans desire peace? I breathed. I felt the floor reading me, felt it probing at the edges of my consciousness, like fingers pressing against frosted glass, testing the barrier between what I said and what I knew. Some do, I said, some do not. But all of us desire survival, and we have learned, through thousands of years of killing each other, that peace is cheaper than war. We do not seek peace because we are moral. We seek it because we have done the math. Every war we have ever fought has cost more than it gained. Every single one. And we are a species that eventually, painfully, reluctantly, learns from its own accounting. The crystal rings beneath my feet pulsed green. Truth confirmed. I felt the floor's grip relax slightly, the neural tendrils pulling back from the edges of my consciousness. The copper-plated warlord settled back in her seat with an expression that might have been respect. The second question came from Kesavek himself. He leaned forward, and his compound eyes narrowed, and I could see him formulating the question with the care of someone laying a mine. Would humanity strike first, if given the opportunity? I felt my heart rate spike, and I felt the floor register it, the crystal rings pulsing faintly yellow as they processed the stress response, and I forced myself to breathe evenly. The floor was reading my fear, but fear is not deception. Fear is the body's honest response to danger. The question was whether I could speak truth through the fear without the floor misinterpreting the signal. We already had the opportunity, I said. 11 years ago, your fleet was repositioning during the Tesseran border incident. For 47 hours, your core worlds were undefended. A gap in your defensive coverage that our intelligence services identified within the first 3 hours. Our military command calculated the strike window. They modeled the attack vectors. They drew up the operational plans, complete with targeting solutions for your 6 primary shipyards and your 3 orbital defense platforms. The plans were detailed, they were viable, they would have worked. I paused. The chamber was absolutely still. And then they locked those plans in a classified archive and chose not to act. Not because we could not, but because we decided that who we wanted to be mattered more than what we could get away with. The plans still exist. I have seen the classification headers. They are sitting in a vault on Earth right now, gathering dust, because 11 years ago, a room full of generals looked at the opportunity to cripple your empire and decided that being the kind of species that attacks an undefended civilization was not worth the strategic advantage. The floor pulsed green, truth confirmed. The chamber erupted, clicking, chittering, the sharp percussive sounds of Vathari agitation rippling through the warlords like a physical wave. Kesavek stood rigid, his compound eyes fixed on me, his massive frame locked in place, as if the floor had seized him too. The translation device picked up fragments of rapid-fire Vathari conversation, overlapping voices arguing about the Tesseran incident, about intelligence failures, about a vulnerability in their defensive posture that they had not known existed, and that a human was now telling them about, calmly and truthfully, while standing on a device that would kill him for lying. The third question silenced all of it, because the third question did not come from a warlord. It came from Serethi. She stood on her platform, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. "Did you carry me from that fire because I was Vathari?" she said, "or because I was a child?" The chamber went absolutely silent. The warlords turned to look up at their queen, with expressions ranging from confusion to shock, to something that looked like the first stages of a fundamental reassessment of everything they thought they knew about their sovereign. None of them knew. I realized it in that moment. None of them knew who she was to me, or what had happened at Kitharis Station. She had kept it hidden for 14 years, buried beneath layers of political calculation and imperial composure, and she had just revealed it in front of the most powerful military body in her empire. I looked up at her. Her compound eyes were burning. Her claws were embedded in the armrest, buried up to the first knuckle. The gold veins in her carapace were pulsing fast, faster than I had ever seen them. "Neither," I said. "I carried you because you were dying, and I could still move. That is all it took. That is all it has ever taken. I did not check your species designation. I did not calculate the diplomatic implications. I did not weigh the risks and benefits. I heard a child dying, and I could still move, and so I moved. That is what humans do. Not because we are heroes, because we cannot stand still while something dies if our legs still work." The floor pulsed green. Truth confirmed. Nobody spoke. Kesavek stood at his seat with his massive scarred body locked in place, and for the first time since I had entered the chamber, he had nothing to say. The bio-neural verification system, the oldest and most trusted legal instrument in Vathari civilization, had just confirmed at a cellular level that I was exactly what I appeared to be. Not a diplomat playing a role, not a soldier hiding behind rhetoric, not a species representative performing for an audience. Just a man who carried a dying child through fire because he could, and who belonged to a species that had chosen restraint when it could have chosen annihilation. Serethi stood. "This council is adjourned until tomorrow. The final vote will be held at the 9th hour." She descended from her platform without looking at any of her warlords, without acknowledging the detonation she had just set off in their understanding of their own queen, and she walked out of the chamber through a side entrance that sealed behind her with a hiss of pressurized air. I was escorted out. The guards walked me through the corridor in silence, and I kept my face neutral, kept my breathing even, kept everything locked down tight, because I knew the warlords had people watching me, and I could not afford to show them what was happening inside my chest, which was something very close to controlled structural collapse. At the entrance to my chamber, a hand caught my arm. I turned. Serethi was there. She had moved through the ship faster than I thought possible, using corridors and passages I had not seen. Her headdress was gone. Her compound eyes were dim, the luminescence pulled inward, the amber and violet facets muted to something that looked almost gray. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said. Her voice was barely audible. I looked at her. What does that mean? She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Her compound eyes searched my face with the same intensity they had shown in the throne room, the same desperate attention, the same need to read something in my expression that she was not sure was there. Then she released my arm, turned, and walked away. Her gold-threaded carapace disappeared around a corner, and the bioluminescent veins in the walls dimmed as she passed, as if the ship itself was acknowledging her mood. I stood in the corridor and stared at the empty space where she had been, and I did not know if she was talking about the negotiation or about something I was not ready to name. The assassination attempt came 4 hours later. I was lying on the sleeping platform, not sleeping, running through scenarios in my head, and trying to calculate how many of the 7 warlords I had actually moved with my testimony. 3, I thought, maybe 3.5, if the copper-plated female's body language meant what I thought it meant. That left 3 solid votes for war, and 1 tiebreaker sitting on the Queen's platform, and I had no idea which way Serethi would vote if it came to that. She had brought me here. She had given me a stage. But she had not promised me an outcome. I heard the sound at 2 in the morning. It was a faint, high-frequency buzz, almost below the threshold of human hearing, a thin whine that existed more as a feeling in my inner ear than as a sound my brain could consciously process. Most people would have missed it entirely. I did not miss it because I had spent 3 years as a combat medic on stations where automated defense drones were a daily hazard, and I knew the wing beat frequency of a barb drone the way a musician knows a wrong note. You do not forget the sound of something designed to kill you quietly. I rolled off the platform a half-second before the barb hit. It buried itself in the wall where my throat had been, a crystalline needle the length of my index finger, still vibrating with residual kinetic energy and leaking a viscous green fluid that hissed and bubbled where it touched the stone. The drone that had delivered it was hovering near the ceiling, a matte black disc the size of my palm, with articulated legs and a targeting sensor that glowed faint red in the darkness. A second barb was already extending from its ventral cavity, locking into firing position. I grabbed the sleeping platform's headrest and ripped it free. It was a solid piece of carved stone, heavy enough to make my shoulder protest, awkward in my grip, but dense enough to matter if I swung it hard enough. The drone dipped toward me, adjusting its angle, and I swung. The headrest connected with a crack that sent the drone spinning into the far wall, where it shattered into components, and twitched twice, and went still. Fragments of black casing and crystal scattered across the floor like broken teeth. I stood there in the dark, breathing hard, holding a broken piece of furniture in both hands, with venom hissing on the wall behind me, and a dead assassin drone at my feet. My right hand was tingling. I looked down and saw a thin line of green fluid across my knuckles where I had grazed the first barb when I rolled off the platform. Minor exposure, surface contact only, but my fingers were already going numb, and a cold sensation was crawling up my wrist. I hit the emergency panel by the door with my left hand. The response was immediate. Guards flooded the corridor within 30 seconds, followed by a medical team with equipment I did not recognize. And then, moving through all of them like a blade through standing water, the Queen. Cyrethi's reaction was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She entered the chamber, and her compound eyes swept the scene in less than a second. The dead drone, the barb in the wall, the venom on my hand, the bruise already forming on my shoulder from swinging the headrest. She processed all of it, and then she went still, in a way that was not calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was the stillness of a detonation in the microsecond before the shockwave reaches you. Her bioluminescence flared so bright that the guards nearest to her stepped back involuntarily, their compound eyes contracting against the glare. The gold veins in her carapace burned like molten wire, and for a moment, in that narrow hexagonal room, she was the brightest thing I had ever seen. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not call for additional security. She turned to the senior guard and spoke one word in Vathari, a word the translation device rendered only as a sharp burst of static, but which made every soldier in the corridor snap to rigid attention so fast that their armor plates clacked. Then she said a name, Kesevex. What happened next took place in the throne chamber, and it took place in front of the full court, and it was the most terrifying display of power I have ever witnessed from any being of any species on any world. Kesevex was dragged in, not escorted, dragged. 4 guards hauled him through the main entrance and threw him onto the obsidian floor at the base of the Queen's platform with enough force to crack one of the tiles beneath him. He was not in restraints. He did not need to be. The 4 guards had their pulse weapons aimed at his head from 4 cardinal points, and even a warlord, as large and as scarred as Kesevex, does not argue with 4 simultaneous kill shots. Cyrethi descended to the floor. She stood over him. Her bioluminescence had not dimmed since my chamber. If anything, it had intensified, and the patterns shifting across her carapace were rapid and chaotic, waves of gold and violet and white that moved like lightning across a storm front. The entire court watched from the balconies, every tear packed, every face turned downward. The silence was the kind that has physical weight, that presses on your eardrums and makes your breathing sound deafening. You attempted to kill a diplomatic envoy under royal protection, Cyrethi said. Her voice was perfectly level. There was no anger in it. There was something much worse than anger. There was the absolute certainty of someone who has already made a decision and is now simply executing it. Kesevex raised his head from the floor. Even prone, he was defiant. His scarred compound eyes found the Queen's face and held it. The human is not a diplomat, he said. He is a prop, a performance piece you have staged to delay the inevitable because you lack the courage to lead this empire into the war it needs. Your sentiment for this creature has compromised your judgment, and I will not allow one childhood debt to override the strategic necessity of eliminating a rival species while we still hold the advantage. You will not allow, Sirethi repeated. The two words fell like stones dropped from a great height. She reached down. Her clawed hand gripped the ceremonial sigil plate on Kesavex's chest, a thick disk of inscribed metal that bore the marks and symbols of his entire ancestral line. I had seen similar plates on every Vathari of rank since I boarded the ship, but I had not understood what they represented until this moment. It was not jewelry. It was not decoration. It was identity. A lineage marker that recorded a warlord's family, campaigns, conquests, rank, name, and place in the history of the Vathari species. Without it, a Vathari of rank was not demoted. They were erased. Sirethi ripped it from his chest. The sound was something I hear in my sleep sometimes. Metal tearing from chitin, pulling plates of carapace with it, leaving a raw, wet wound in the center of Kesavex's thorax that leaked dark fluid onto the obsidian floor. He did not scream. He made a sound that was worse than screaming, a low, grinding vibration that I felt in my teeth and in the bones of my skull. The sound of a being whose entire identity was being ripped away in front of 1,000 witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Sirethi held the sigil plate up. The court watched. Then she closed her fist around it and crushed it. The inscribed metal crumpled and folded and collapsed into fragments that fell from her claws and scattered across the obsidian floor. Each fragment caught the bioluminescent light as it fell, glinting for a moment, and then going dark as it settled among the cracks in the tiles. "You are no longer warlord," she said. Her voice carried to every tier of the balcony, to every corner of the chamber, to every ear that was listening. "You are no longer Kesavex. You have no name. You have no lineage. You have no record in the annals of this empire. You will be escorted from this ship in a blank shell, and you will spend the remainder of your existence knowing that you sacrificed everything you were for the chance to kill one unarmed man in his sleep. And you failed." The guards lifted him. He did not resist. His compound eyes were dim, nearly lightless, and his massive body moved with the loose, disconnected passivity of something that had been hollowed out from the inside. They carried him toward the exit, and the courtiers on the balconies turned their faces away as he passed. In Vathari culture, to look at a stripped individual is to acknowledge that they exist, and acknowledgement is the last mercy they are permitted. The courtiers gave him nothing, not even their gaze. The remaining 6 warlords stood along the side of the chamber, witnesses to the display. None of them spoke. None of them moved. They watched their queen crush a colleague's entire identity with her bare hand, and they understood the message with perfect, crystalline clarity. Whatever they thought about the humans standing in their war council, the cost of acting on it had just been demonstrated in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. The court dispersed. The chamber emptied, and Sirethi found me in the medical bay, where a Vathari physician was treating the venom exposure on my right hand with a neutralizing compound that smelled like burnt sugar and felt like ice water being injected directly into my veins. She dismissed the physician. The door sealed. We were alone. For a long moment, she said nothing. She stood with her back to the sealed door and her arms at her sides, and I watched the bioluminescence in her carapace cycle through patterns I had never seen before. Rapid shifting waves of gold and amber and deep violet that moved across her exoskeleton like weather systems crossing a planet's surface, each pattern bleeding into the next without pause, a visual representation of emotional turbulence that no Vathari would ever display voluntarily. "I have spent 14 years building this," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything. No ceremony, no authority, no imperial resonance, just a voice. Just a person talking to another person in a medical bay that smelled like burnt sugar and antiseptic. Every alliance I have forged, every political maneuver I have executed, every compromise I have made with warlords I despised and advisors I did not trust. I engineered my ascent to this throne for one purpose, one single purpose that has driven every decision I have made since I was old enough to understand what a decision was. To ensure that the Vathari Empire never attacked the species that produced the man who carried me through fire. She turned to face me. Her compound eyes were bright, brighter than I had ever seen them, and the fracture patterns in the amber and violet facets were shifting rapidly, cycling in sequences that looked almost like text. almost like a language that existed only in light. Kesevex nearly destroyed everything, she said. 14 years of my life. He nearly burned it all in a single act of stubborn arrogance, because he could not accept that a human standing on a verification floor and telling the truth was a greater threat to his worldview than a fleet. I looked at her. The venom treatment was making my hand ache, but I kept still and kept my eyes on hers. Why did you really bring me here? I asked. The truth. Not the version you gave me in the throne room. Not the diplomatic version. The truth. The question hung in the air between us. She could have given me the strategic answer, the calculated answer, the answer that a sovereign gives when she is managing a diplomatic crisis and cannot afford to show her hand. You are the only human I will permit to argue for your species. She did not give me that answer. Because if the war begins and humanity falls, she said, and her voice cracked on the word falls. The first time I had heard anything in her voice that was not controlled, not measured, not deliberately modulated. I wanted you to survive. I stared at her. I prepared a sanctuary, she continued. A hidden settlement on a neutral world outside the conflict zone, shielded from detection, supplied with enough resources to sustain a small population indefinitely. If the council votes for war tomorrow, I was going to put you on a shuttle tonight and send you there. You and your 2 crew members. You would live. Your species would burn, but you would live. And I would know that the debt was paid, that the man who saved my life was safe, even if nothing else was. The words hit me in a place that I did not know I had left exposed. She had not brought me here to save my species. She had brought me here to save me. The negotiation was real. The opportunity was genuine. But beneath all of it, beneath the strategy and the politics and the 14 years of careful planning, was something much older and simpler and more desperate than diplomacy. A child repaying a debt by rescuing the man who had rescued her, even if it meant rescuing only him while everything else burned. No, I said. Her compound eyes shifted. The amber facets brightened. The violet dimmed. No, I said again. If humanity burns, I burn with it. I do not leave my people behind. I do not hide on a neutral world while my species fights for survival without me. That is not a negotiable point, and it is not something you can overrule, not even as queen. You want to send my crew to safety, I will not stop you. That is their choice. But if the fleet launches, you put me on the first ship in its path, because I would rather die with my people than live knowing I abandoned them. I expected anger. I expected imperial fury. I expected her to pull rank and status and 8 feet of sovereign authority and crash it down on my refusal, like a wave on a rock. Instead, Serethi smiled. It was not a human smile. It was a subtle shifting of mandible plates and a brightening of the amber facets in her compound eyes and a slight relaxation of the tension in her jaw structure. But I had spent 6 hours with a Vathari juvenile pressed against my chest, and I knew what it looked like when one of them was pleased. That, she said, is exactly what I told the council you would say. I went very still. Your refusal is the final variable, she said. I needed my warlords to see it, not in a speech, not in a right of veracity, in a living, breathing, verifiable choice made by a human who was offered personal survival and rejected it because he would not separate himself from his species. That is the argument no warlord can counter. Not because it is noble, not because it is brave, but because it is proof. Proof that you cannot separate a human from its people. Proof that destroying humanity means fighting every single one of them, every last one, until there is nothing left on either side. Not because they are ordered to fight, but because they will not permit themselves to do otherwise. She stepped closer. She was so close I could feel the faint warmth of her bioluminescence against my skin, a soft, radiant heat that pulsed with her heartbeat. Your refusal will be my testimony at the final vote, she said. The evidence that humanity is not a species you defeat. It is a species you endure, or a species you bleed against until you have forgotten why you started. She turned and walked toward the door. She paused with her clawed hand on the seal. Thank you, she said, without looking back, for carrying me through the fire, and for refusing to put yourself above your people. You have not changed in 14 years, Ethan Voss. You are exactly what I remembered. She left. The door sealed. I sat in the medical bay with a throbbing hand and a chest full of something I could not classify and did not try to. And I stared at the wall, and I thought about a small, pale green child gripping my finger while I whispered promises I never expected to keep, and she somehow held me to. The final vote convened at the 9th hour. The War Council chamber was configured differently than the day before. The holographic dome still displayed the invasion fleet, 600 warship icons arranged in strike formation, each one pulsing with a faint red glow that indicated combat readiness. But the seating had changed. 6 chairs now instead of 7. The gap where Kesevex had sat was conspicuous and raw, a wound in the symmetry of the crescent that every warlord could see and every warlord understood. Cyrethi sat on her elevated platform in full ceremonial regalia, the dark metal headdress framing her face, the gold threads in her carapace pulsing with slow, measured rhythm. I stood below, in the center of the chamber, on the same verification floor where I had answered 3 questions and felt a machine read the truth out of my nervous system. The floor was dormant now, the crystal rings dark, but I could still feel the ghost of its touch beneath my feet, a memory embedded in my nerve endings. The galleries above the chamber were occupied. Not just courtiers this time, officers, commanders, flight crews, engineers, crew members from every level of the dreadnought's hierarchy, packed into the observation tiers and standing in the aisles and crowding the entrances. And beyond the chamber, I knew, the proceedings were being broadcast live across the entire Vathari Empire. Every ship in the fleet, every world, every colony, every citizen. This was not a closed session. This was a civilization watching itself decide whether to go to war. Cyrethi opened the proceedings without ceremony. The matter before this council is the proposed military action against the United Earth territories, authorized by the High Council vote of the 7th cycle. The war authorization stands unless a majority of this body votes to rescind. I will hear final arguments and then we will vote. The first warlord to speak was Thanaxis, the copper-plated female who had asked me the first question in the right of veracity. She spoke for 12 minutes, and her argument was precise and economic. She laid out the resource projections for a protracted conflict, the fuel consumption of 600 warships operating at combat readiness across 400 light-years of contested space, the logistical strain of maintaining supply lines through neutral territories, the estimated casualty figures on both sides calculated across 3 different conflict duration models. Her conclusion was not moral. It was mathematical. The war would cost the Vathari Empire more than it could gain, even in the most optimistic scenario, even assuming total victory within the first 2 years, which her models indicated was improbable. The second speaker was Vorath, a warlord with a carapace so dark it was nearly black, who commanded the Empire's deep space reconnaissance fleet. His argument was the opposite of Thanaxis's. He argued for war, and his reasoning was strategic rather than economic. Humanity was expanding too fast, he said, colonizing too aggressively, developing technology at a rate that the Vathari could not match in peacetime. Every year that passed without conflict was a year in which the balance of power shifted further toward the species that adapted faster, and by every metric he had access to, humans adapted faster. If war was inevitable, and Vorath argued forcefully that it was, then it was better to fight now, while the advantage was still theirs, rather than wait and fight later when it might not be. The third speaker, a warlord named Sileni, argued for deferral. Not peace, not war, a middle path. She proposed a containment strategy, a military cordon around human space that would limit expansion without triggering the retaliatory mechanisms I had described. It was a compromise position, and I could see from the body language of the other warlords, from the way they held themselves, and the way their compound eyes moved, that it satisfied nobody. Compromises rarely do in rooms where the options are fire or restraint. 3 more spoke. Their arguments occupied the middle ground between Thanaxis's economics and Vorath's aggression, hedged with conditional language and qualified projections that could support either position, depending on which assumptions you accepted. They were waiting. I could feel it. They wanted to see which way the wind was blowing before they committed their votes, and the wind in that chamber was shifting with every speaker. Cyrethi called for the vote. Her voice cut through the last murmurs of discussion like a knife through water. Warlord Thanaxis. Stand down. No hesitation. The copper-plated warlord had made her decision before she entered the chamber. Her compound eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and I saw in them something that was not quite approval, but was close enough to count. Warlord Vorath. War. Also no hesitation. Vorath sat rigid in his dark carapace, his eyes fixed on the holographic fleet above him, and his vote came out like a command to the ships themselves. Warlord Selene. A pause. The chamber held its breath. Selene sat forward in her chair, her pale green carapace catching the light, her compound eyes moving between me and the holographic dome and the gap where Kesavex's chair had been. Stand down, she said. Warlord Dreth. Another pause. Dreth was the oldest of the six, his carapace faded to a pale gray that spoke of decades of service. His compound eyes cloudy with age, but sharp with an experience that transcended physical acuity. He had fought in wars that most of his colleagues had only studied. He had buried soldiers, and he had burned cities, and he knew what those things cost in ways that projections and models could never capture. War, he said. The word came out heavy, weighted with something that sounded almost like regret. 2 and 2. My stomach tightened. Warlord Kissin. Kissin was the youngest warlord in the chamber, his carapace still glossy with the sheen of recent maturity, his movements quick and sharp and slightly too eager. He sat forward and looked at me. He looked at the holographic fleet. He looked at the empty chair, and then he looked up at his queen, and whatever he saw on her face, whatever signal he read in the patterns of her bioluminescence, it decided him. Stand down, he said. 3-2. One vote remained. Warlord Oressus. The chamber contracted around that name. Every gaze, every compound eye, every breath focused on the quietest member of the council. Oressus had said almost nothing during both sessions. She was average-sized for a Vaethari, unremarkable in appearance, her carapace a muted gray-brown that did not catch the light or throw it back. But I had noticed something about her that transcended appearances. The other warlords deferred to her in subtle ways, angling their bodies toward her during discussions, pausing to gauge her reactions before committing to their own positions. She held weight in this room that had nothing to do with size or spectacle. It was the weight of a mind that moved carefully and arrived at conclusions that others trusted, even when they did not like them. Oressus stood. She looked at me for a long time, her compound eyes steady and unreadable, scanning my face with a thoroughness that made the verification floor seem casual by comparison. Then she looked up at her queen. War, she said. 3-3. The word dropped into the chamber like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward in every direction, through the warlords and the galleries and the broadcast feeds, carrying this moment to every corner of the Vaethari Empire. A tie. The tiebreaker fell to the sovereign. Every being in the chamber knew it. Every being watching across the empire knew it. Cyrethi Vel Caraxis, 42nd sovereign of the Vaethari Empire, would cast the deciding vote on whether to launch the largest military operation in galactic history. She stood. The bioluminescence in her carapace flared bright, brighter than ceremony, brighter than anger. Gold threads burning like filaments in the dim light of the chamber, until she seemed to glow from within like something molten. She looked down at her 6 warlords. She looked at the holographic fleet above her, 600 warships waiting for a word. She looked at me. I have heard the arguments, she said. Strategic, economic, military. I have heard projections and models, and historical comparisons. I have heard a human stand on the verification floor and describe his species with a candor that cost him nothing to give, because it was true. I have watched that same human refuse personal salvation because he would not abandon his people. And I have watched one of my own warlords attempt to murder an unarmed envoy in his sleep because he was afraid, not of the human, but of what the human represented. She paused. The chamber was so silent that I could hear the hum of the crystal rings beneath my feet. Dormant, but not dead. The question before this council is not whether we can defeat humanity. The question is what we become in the process of trying. I have studied this species. I have studied them for 14 years, longer and more carefully than any intelligence analyst in this empire, with a depth of personal experience that none of you share, and I will tell you what I have learned. She descended from her platform. Step by step, her clawed feet clicking on the dark stone, she walked to the center of the chamber, to the edge of the verification floor where I stood. She stopped beside me, not facing me, facing her warlords. Humans are not strong, she said, not individually. They are fragile in ways that would be comical if they were not so baffling. Their bones fracture under stresses that a Vathari adolescent could endure without discomfort. Their skin tears. Their organs fail. They require constant temperature regulation, constant nutrition, constant maintenance. If you measure them by any single physical metric, they are unremarkable, forgettable, dismissible. She turned her head slightly toward me. The amber facets in her compound eyes caught the light and threw it back in patterns that burned. But they do not operate by single metrics. They operate by a principle that has no equivalent in our language, no analog in our culture, no precedent in our history. A principle so alien to our way of thinking that we have consistently failed to account for it in every strategic model we have built, every threat assessment we have conducted, every war game we have run. The principle is this: they will die for each other. Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical position or a cultural aspiration, as a reflex, as automatically and as irresistibly as breathing. A human will walk into fire for a stranger, not for family, not for tribe, not for nation, for a stranger, for someone they have never met and will never meet again. I know this because one of them walked into fire for me. The chamber was absolutely still. The broadcast was carrying her words to every corner of the empire. A war against this species is a war against that principle, she said. And that principle does not have a defeat condition. You cannot bomb it out of them. You cannot breed it out of them. You cannot negotiate it away or starve it into submission. It is woven into the fabric of what they are, so deep that a machine designed to read truth at a cellular level confirmed it without hesitation. It is what they are. And as long as even one of them is still alive, that principle is still operational, and the war is not over. You may destroy their fleets. You may glass their worlds. You may reduce their civilization to ash, and the last human standing in the rubble will still look at you, and still fight you, and still refuse to surrender, not because they are ordered to, but because they are incapable of doing otherwise. She looked at Vorath. She looked at Dreth. She looked at Oressus. She held each gaze long enough that the weight of her attention was unmistakable, long enough that each of them felt the Queen's eyes as a physical pressure. My vote is to stand down, she said. The war authorization is rescinded. Formal diplomatic negotiations with the United Earth government will commence within one cycle. The chamber erupted, not into chaos, but into a release of tension so massive that it manifested as sound. Thanaxis slammed her fist against the arm of her chair with a percussive crack that split the stone. Kissen stood and bowed, his young carapace gleaming. Selene exhaled a long chittering breath and closed her compound eyes. Vorath and Dreth remained seated, their faces unreadable, their silence louder and more eloquent than any objection they might have voiced. Oressus looked at the Queen for a long moment, her expression unreadable even by Vathari standards, and then she inclined her head in the smallest possible nod. Not agreement necessarily. Acknowledgement, the recognition that the decision was made and the Empire would live with it. It was over. Not permanently, not definitively. The warlords who had voted for war would not forget their reasons, and the strategic concerns that had driven the vote in the first place had not evaporated with the Queen's words. But for now, for today, for this moment, 600 warships would hold their positions, and 11 billion humans across 36 worlds would wake up tomorrow without knowing how close they had come to not waking up at all. I was escorted to a communications suite, 3 levels above the council chamber. It was the first time in 3 days that I had access to a transmitter capable of reaching human space. The console was Vathari in design, its interface built for clawed hands and compound eyes, but the communications protocol was universal. I sat down, keyed in the emergency diplomatic frequency for the United Earth Foreign Affairs Bureau, and sent a 2-line report. War deferred. Recommend sending real diplomats. I sat there for a while after that. The console blinked at me, waiting for additional input. I had none to give. I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, past the ache in my muscles, and the throb in my venom-treated hand, and the burn of sleep deprivation behind my eyes. It was a deeper exhaustion, located in the part of the brain that processes the near misses, the almost catastrophes, the moments where the margin between survival and extinction was thin enough to see through. I had stood in the center of that margin for 3 days, and now that the pressure was off, every system in my body was demanding that I acknowledge what had almost happened, and then lie down and not move for a very long time. Danny and Lena found me there. They had been held in a separate section of the ship, unharmed and adequately fed, but completely in the dark about what had been happening in the council chamber. Danny looked at my bruised wrists and my bandaged hand, and the expression on my face and said, "What happened?" And I said, "I will tell you later," and he had the sense and the decency not to push. Our shuttle was prepared for departure within the hour, our own shuttle, the one they had boarded and seized 3 days ago, repaired and refueled, and sitting in the Dreadnought's launch bay, with its hull patched and its comms array restored to full functionality. Someone had even cleaned the interior and restocked the emergency rations. The Vathari are thorough, even in their hospitality, when they choose to extend it. Cyrethi met me at the shuttle bay. The formality was back in full force. The headdress, the ceremonial posture, the imperial bearing that turned every movement into a statement, and every word into an edict. The launch bay was occupied by ground crew and flight officers, and security personnel. 100 Vathari eyes watching their queen say goodbye to the human who had just talked them out of a war. Every gesture would be analyzed. Every word would be recorded. The Empire was watching. She extended a diplomatic seal, a heavy disc of inscribed metal on a chain, the Vathari equivalent of a passport and a shield combined. It marked me as an immune envoy of the crown, untouchable by any Vathari military or civilian authority anywhere in the Empire for the rest of my natural life. A significant gift, a meaningful protection, a piece of metal that said, in the language of Empire, "This one is mine." I took it. Our fingers did not touch. The court was watching. But as the seal settled into my palm, I felt something else beneath it. Something small, something rough-edged. Something that had no diplomatic weight, and no legal significance, and no place in any formal exchange between a sovereign and an envoy. I closed my hand around both objects and did not look down. "Safe travels, Commander Voss," Cyrethi said. Her voice was formal. Her compound eyes were not. The amber facets were burning. The violet ones were dim. The combination produced an expression that I had never seen on a Vathari face before, and that I understood completely, not because I had studied their species, but because some expressions do not belong to any species. They belong to anyone who has ever said goodbye to someone they did not want to let go. "Thank you, Your Majesty," I said. My voice was formal. My chest was not. I turned and walked toward the shuttle. Danny and Lena were already inside, running pre-flight checks with the quiet efficiency of people who have been trained to function normally, even when nothing around them is normal. I climbed the boarding ramp and stopped at the top. I did not look back. I wanted to. I wanted to turn around and look at her one more time. Not the queen, but the child. The small, pale green juvenile with the cracked carapace, and the desperate clicking, and the grip on my finger that would not let go even when the sedative was pulling her under. But the court was watching, and 100 compound eyes were reading every micro-expression on my face with the precision of a targeting array, and I could not afford to show them what was happening behind my eyes. Not as a diplomat, not as a representative of my species. I could not let them see that the man who had just argued for humanity's survival was standing on a boarding ramp with his throat tight and a sting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with venom exposure. I stepped inside. The ramp sealed behind me. I walked past Danny at the pilot's console and Lena at the comm station, and I sat down in the rear compartment where nobody could see me, and I opened my hand. The diplomatic seal lay on my palm, heavy and official and cold. Beneath it, partially hidden by its weight, was a fragment of metal. Small, roughly triangular, blackened with soot and age. One edge was smooth, machine-cut. The other edges were jagged, torn by force. I turned it over in my fingers and saw, beneath the soot, a partial serial number etched into the surface. KYT-7, Catheris Station, Evacuation Shuttle 7. She had kept it. For 14 years, through her rise from orphan juvenile to sovereign of an empire, through every alliance and betrayal and political maneuver that had carried her to the highest seat of power in the quadrant, she had carried a piece of the shuttle that had carried us both to safety. A shard of burned metal from the worst night of my life, and the night that had apparently defined hers. It was warm. Not from residual engine heat, not from the ambient temperature of the launch bay. It was warm because she had been holding it in her clenched fist the entire time she stood in that shuttle bay, pressing it against her palm while she said goodbye, in a language that was not her own, to a man she had spent half her life searching for. I closed my hand around it. I leaned back against the seat. The shuttle engines hummed to life, and I felt the deck vibrate as we lifted off the Dreadnought's launch platform and slid through the atmospheric barrier into the open silence of space. Through the rear viewport, I watched the Dreadnought shrink. It was enormous, even at distance, a mountain of black metal and bioluminescent light hanging in the void, like something ancient and patient. Around it, visible as pinpoints of reflected starlight against the darkness, the invasion fleet held its position. 600 warships, 40 billion soldiers, all of them staying exactly where they were, because a woman who had once been a dying child had decided that the species that saved her deserved to keep existing. I held the metal fragment against my chest, right where I had held her, 14 years ago, in a cold shuttle, with failing life support, while I whispered promises I never expected anyone to hear, let alone remember, let alone build an empire around. Yeah, I said, to no one, to the stars, to the small frightened girl who was now the most powerful being in the quadrant, and who had just saved 11 billion lives with a single word. I remember you. The shuttle banked toward human space. Behind us, the Vathari dreadnought held its position, its bioluminescent veins pulsing in the darkness, not advancing, not retreating, waiting, and for the first time in 11 years, that felt like enough.